Bonjour, bienvenue dans ce webinaire organisé par
Welcome
la
to our
Ferdi.
webinar
Le
organized by
troisième de
Ferdi.
série de séminaires
It
qui
is
est
the third
organisé sur
webinar in a
un
series
sujet complexe mais
on the
clé
very complex but essential topic of
des
the
origines
origins
et
and
des objectifs
objectives
des
of
financements
concessional
concessionnels.
funding.
Parce que les financements concessionnels
Currently, it's
sont
mobilized
aujourd'hui
not
mobilisés
only
beaucoup
for
seulement pour
economic
le développement
development
économique des pays
in low and middle
les
income
faibles et
countries,
intermédiaires,
but is now
mais
also
ils sont
used
utilisés aussi
for
pour les biens
global
publics
public
mondiaux.
goods. And
Et
this
cela pose
raises a number of
un nombre
issues.
de problématiques, des problématiques de
First of
mobilisation,
all, to do with
puisque
resource
en fonction des
mobilization,
objectifs,
because
ce ne sont pas
depending
forcément
on the
les mêmes,
objectives,
en tout cas les mêmes métriques qui
the
permettent
same
d'être
metrics
utilisées
will
pour
not apply
mobiliser des fonds pour le
to
développement
mobilize funds for
durable
sustainable
d'un côté
economic
et pour
development on one hand,
l'infrastructure
and
de
then
l'autre.
for global
Le
public goods on the
sujet
other.
sur la mobilisation a été traité par le
So
premier webinaire de
mobilization
cette
was
série.
covered in the first
Le
webinar of
deuxième,
our series.
la
The
deuxième
second
problématique est bien sûr celle de l'allocation.
covered
Comme on voit
allocation of funding.
également géographiquement les fonds de la même manière si
Geographically, the funds are
c'était
not
le développement
allocated in the
économique
same way
ou
if it's
si
for
c'était
economic development or if it's
des biens publics
for
mondiaux,
global
la
public
gestion
goods.
des biens publics mondiaux. Et donc pour avoir aussi une
To
idée
also have an idea
claire et
of the scope and
d'équilibrée
the
de ces deux
difficulty
problématiques,
of
et aussi
these
pour
two items, as well
mesurer
as to measure the
l'impact
impact of
de
these
ces fonds en
flows,
fonction de ces
depending
divergences,
on their
il
objectives,
est
it's
important
important
d'avoir de
to
bonnes
be able to
mesures,
measure them
un bon système de mesure.
with
Et c'est
a
le thème
consistent system.
de
And
ce
that is
webinaire
the topic of today's
aujourd'hui.
webinar.
Alors pour traiter ce webinaire, pour traiter
To talk
ce
on this
webinaire, je
topic,
vais
I will
immédiatement
immediately give the
passer
floor
la parole
to
à
Serge
Serge
Tomasi.
Tomasi, qui est
He is a
ancien
former
ambassadeur
French
de France
ambassador,
et qui est aussi
as well as
senior
being
fellow
a senior
à
fellow
la
at
Ferdi,
Ferdi,
et qui a
and
écrit
who
un
wrote
papier
a
publié sur le
paper
site
which you'll
Economist
find
sur
on
les
the
financements
Ferdi
publics du
website
développement et des
on financing
infrastructures
global public
pour
goods
le
and
development,
development,
qui est au cœur
which is at the
de nos
heart
questions.
of this
Donc
issue.
je
So
passe
I
tout de
will
suite la
immediately give
parole
the floor to
à
Serge
Serge Tomasi
Tomasi,
qui va brosser
who will
le
say a few
tableau
words
de cette
about
problématique
these
et,
issues
des
and
des
possible
possibilités
funding
et des
and
mesures des
possible
possibilités
measures
de ces deux financements,
for these
ces
two
deux types de
types of
financement.
funding.
Alors
Serge,
Serge, la
over
parole
to you.
est à toi.
Thank you,
Merci
Bruno.
Bruno et bonjour à toutes
Hello,
et à
everyone.
tous. Je vais faire pour introduire
To
ce débat, aborder
introduce
deux
this debate,
questions
I will
très
introduce two
brièvement,
brief
qui sont
questions.
le
First of all, the
pourquoi
why
et
and
le comment.
how.
Pourquoi
Why
veut-on
do we
essayer
want
de
to
distinguer
distinguish
dans suivi des
or to
financements
monitor
les financements du
flows for
développement et
development
les
and flows
financements
for
des biens
global
publics
public
mondiaux?
goods?
Et puis ensuite,
I
j'aborderai
will then
le
look into
comment
how.
peut-on essayer
How
de
can we distinguish
distinguer.
the two?
Alors sur
So, first
le
of all,
pourquoi,
why?
c'est une question qui est assez
It's a
légitime
legitimate
parce
question
que quelque part avec
because
l'agenda
with the 2030
2030, on a
agenda, it
décidé
was
de
decided to
fusionner
merge
l'agenda du
the
développement et
development
l'agenda de
agenda and the
l'environnement en
environment
mettant
agenda by
notamment
integrating
la question
questions
du
of the
climat
climate
dans
to
les
do with
ODD.
the SDGs.
Mais il nous paraît, nous, toujours
But we believe
essentiel
it's
de
essential
distinguer
to
ces
distinguish
financements
between these two
pour
types of flows for two reasons
raisons essentielles.
overall.
La
The
première,
first
c'est que
reason
le but ultime et les
is that
populations bénéficiaires
the
de ces financements
populations
ne sont
who
pas les mêmes.
benefit from this
Si on
funding
finance
and
un
the objectives
projet de
aren't the same.
développement,
If it's for
on vise
development,
à
the
promouvoir
goal is
le
to develop the
développement
economic
économique et l'amélioration des
conditions and to
conditions
improve
de
the
vie
living
et de
conditions of
situation des pays en
populations
développement.
in developing
C'est la
countries.
définition
This
l'aide
is
FICA
the
du service de
development. This
développement
is the definition
qui
provided
vise à
by the Development
financer ces fonds
Assistance
de
Committee.
développement essentiellement par le revenu moyen
And
par
this is measured
habitant.
in terms
Ce
of
sont donc des financements qui sont
average
ciblés, je dirais
income per
territorialisés,
habitant.
et qui bénéficient à des populations
And global
clairement
public goods,
identifiées
oh, sorry,
en fonction de leur
So these
niveau de
depend on the
revenu.
level of revenue or the level of poverty for development
À
finance.
l'inverse, quand on finance des
However, when you're
projets
funding
qui touchent aux biens publics
projects
mondiaux, on
pertaining
est
to
dans une
global
autre
public
logique.
goods, the logic is
Il
different
s'agit de
because the
financer des
goal is to
programmes
fund
qui,
programs
même si leur mise en œuvre se situe dans un pays
and
donné,
which, wherever
leurs
they
effets
are
vont bien
implemented,
au-delà des
their
frontières
effects will go well beyond
nationales, en
national
fait, et
borders and
bénéficier à
actually
l'ensemble de la
benefit the
population
entire world
mondiale.
population.
C'est
This
l'idée
is the
même
very
du
idea
bien commun.
behind a global public
Si on
good.
parle, par exemple,
We talk
des
about
projets d'atténuation
mitigation
en matière de
projects
financement du climat, il est
for the
clair que
climate.
leurs
Obviously,
bénéfices
these
ne se
benefits
limitent pas
will
aux
not
seules
only
populations
be limited to
nationales,
national
mais vont
populations,
toucher
but will
l'ensemble de la population
benefit the
mondiale.
entire
Il y
world
a
population.
un bénéfice global
There's a
de
global
ce type de
benefit for that
projet.
sort of project.
Ça,
So
c'est la
that's the
première
first
raison. La
reason.
deuxième raison,
The second
c'est la
reason
fameuse
is the
question
question of
additionalité.
additionalities.
Puisque vous savez que depuis la
Since
Convention
the
de
Rio
Rio
Convention in
1992,
1992,
toutes les
all of
COP
the climate
climat
COPs
ont pris
have
l'engagement
committed
que les
to
financements
ensuring that
climat devaient
climate
être
funding would be
additionnels à l'aide
added to
publique au
official
développement
development
traditionnelle.
assistance.
Et donc, si on veut
So if we
vérifier
want
cette
to ensure that it
additionnalité,
is
il
in
faut que
addition,
ce
we have
soit
to
en
be able
régime
to
de distinction.
distinguish
Cela est
the
assez
two
essentiel
financing
quand on
flows.
voit que,
This is
par exemple,
essential
dans
because
l'allocation de la finance
climate
climat,
funding
il n'était
allocation is mainly
mentionné
based
au bénéfice
on
des pays à
or
revenus
serves mainly to
intermédiaires et notamment
benefit
des pays à revenus
intermediate
intermédiaires de
income
revenus
level
supérieurs,
countries.
70%
70%
de la
of
finance
climate
climat
funding
va
goes
à
to
la
these
finance
middle
climat.
income
Et seulement
countries, and only
30%
10%
va
goes to
aux pays à
low
faible
income
revenu.
countries.
Alors le
So
TOSDI,
TOSDI
justement, a été le
was the
premier
first
instrument de
measurement
mesure qui a
instrument
essayé
which
de
attempted
mettre en
to
place cette
distinguish
distinction entre financement du développement,
development
c'est ce qu'on
funding,
appelle le pilier
Pillar
1,
1,
et,
as it
et
is called,
financement des biens
and
publics
funding
mondiaux,
of
c'est le
global public
pilier
goods,
2. Mais je
Pillar
pense que
2.
Thomas
But I
va
believe that
faire un peu
Tomas
plus
will have
léger,
more to say about this.
donc je passe très vite. Et
So
je
I will
passe
move straight on
à
to
la
the
deuxième
second
question,
question,
du
which
comment.
is
Comment
how?
peut-on
How can we
distinguer
distinguish
le suivi de ces types de
the
financement?
monitoring of these two
Alors,
types of funding?
traditionnellement, la réponse
Traditionally, the
a
answer has
été
been,
qu'il fallait, en fait,
well,
pour
for each
programme
program
de financement
or
du
climate
climat, vous
funding,
savez que deux
there are
secteurs
two sectors,
sont
transport and energy,
responsables de
which represent
50 et
about
60% de la
60% of
financement.
climate funding.
L'idée
The
était, en
goal
fait,
was
qu'il
that for
fallait,
each of those
chacun
projects,
s'engager, calculer
it was
les
necessary to
coûts
calculate the
liés
costs
au
linked
développement de la production
to the
d'énergie
development
ou des moyens
of
de transport selon
means
des
to produce
méthodes
electricity
traditionnelles
or means
et
for
essayer
transportation,
d'isoler le
and to
coût
see how much it would cost
additionnel
traditionally, and then add
lié
the extra
au
cost it would
recours
have
à des
if
méthodes à basse émission
low carbon
de
solutions
carbone.
were
Le
adopted.
François
I believe that
Bourguignon,
François
dans son
Bourguignon in our second
séminaire,
seminar
l'avait d'ailleurs
mentioned
introduit.
this.
Alors,
And
c'est une
this is a
proposition qui
proposal
est là
which has
depuis
been
très
around for
longtemps, mais en
30
fait, elle n'a
years,
jamais
but
été
which has never
très
really
mise
been
en œuvre.
implemented.
Et
And
personnellement,
personally, I'm a little bit skeptical.
incontestablement, elle est plus
Clearly, it's more
satisfaisante sur le
satisfactory,
papier, d'ailleurs,
intellectually
puisqu'
speaking,
elle est assez
because
fine, elle
this
permet
distinction is quite fine. And for
chaque
each
projet
project,
de distinguer
this would make it possible to
les
see what the
coûts naturels
development
et les
costs
coûts
are and what the sustainable
mais,
development costs would be.
c'est très
But it's very
difficile en
hard
fait
to do actually
à
in
mettre en œuvre
practice,
en pratique parce que
because this would entail that for each
chaque
project,
projet, on ait quasiment une double
there be a
comptabilité
sort of double accounting
pour
to be able to
calculer le coût
calculate
du même
the cost
projet
of
mis en
the
œuvre selon,
project
je dirais, la
implemented
méthode
with traditional
traditionnelle
methods and
et
how
celui
much
des
the project would
projets
cost if it
selon
were
les méthodes
implemented
de basse
using
émission
low
carbone
carbon
qui sont
solutions.
aujourd'hui privilégiées. Donc ça crée
So
quand même un fardeau
this
administratif
increases the administrative burden
et ça va être de plus en plus
and
aléatoire
will be
au
more
fur
and
et à
more
mesure qu'en fait les
haphazard
méthodes
because
traditionnelles, on peut l'espérer, vont être
little by
abandonnées
little, we hope,
et
traditional
tourneront
methods
au
will be
profit de
abandoned
projets
in
qui
favor of
s'inscriront clairement dans une
projects
démarche de basse
which
émission.
aim to
Donc,
reduce
dans mon
their
rapport
carbon
à
emissions.
l'interdit que
In the
Bruno a
report that
mentionné,
Bruno
j'ai
mentioned,
proposé
I
une autre
suggested
méthode
another
qui consiste
methodology
en fait à
which
distinguer dans
in
la
climate
finance
funding
climat
distinguishes
les
between
financements en faveur de
finding
l'adaptation
funding for
et les
adaptation and
financements en
funding
faveur
for
de
mitigation.
l'atténuation. Parce que quand on
Because
est dans
When it's a question of adaptation, this is a project that meets the definition of official development assistance. It targets populations in developing countries, a specific territory which will benefit. And we aim to improve the living conditions of that population by reducing their vulnerability and the exogenous impact of climate change. In contrast, mitigation projects should be clearly flagged as climate finance because their overarching goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, they benefit the entire world population. So this is clearly a different type of undertaking. And I believe that separating adaptation and mitigation would make it possible to quite easily distinguish between these two funding mechanisms. And this is important because from experience, we know that funding monitoring must be grounded in reliable data, data which is available. And this is the case because generally all donors distinguish adaptation projects from mitigation projects. And I would also like to insist on the fact that it's a very strong logic underpinning this because with the mitigation project, the goal is to have the maximal marginal efficiency. So you seek to fund programs in countries with very high greenhouse gas emissions, which is why in climate funding allocation, most of this funding goes to intermediate income level countries, emerging economies, which emit much more greenhouse gas emissions than low income countries. So again, the distinction, I believe, is indispensable. I will stop here. Thank you to all of you. Thank you very much, Serge. Indeed, what you have just said echoes a paper written by Thomas Hoss with Sylviane Guillaumont and Clara Pugnier, which shows that based on statistics of the DAC, that allocation of funding for projects essentially for climate mitigation are mostly allocated to middle and upper level income countries, those with the highest emissions, therefore where the efficiency and the effectiveness of these projects is highest. This well illustrates the usefulness and why it's important to distinguish these two types of metrics. And this paves the way for Thomas Hoss, who is the senior analyst at TOSDI, so Total Official Support for Sustainable Development. It's an alternative indicator which aggregates but distinguishes all public flows, not just concessional flows, to fund global public goods and sustainable development. So, Tomas, you have the floor. This is clearly a very important building block of what Serge was saying. So how can we distinguish these flows? Thank you very much for having invited me here. So I have a short presentation to share some ideas with you. I hope you can see on the slide. So I have two separate parts to my presentation. First of all, a few results from the analyses that we carried out with Sylviane, which I hope will well complement Serge's intervention. And then in the second part, I will say a few words on how the TOSD separates mitigation and adaptation. So first of all, the analysis. A year ago, we asked ourselves the question of what were the effects of mitigation to climate change on the allocation of official development assistance at a political level. So we carried out a little conceptual work, and our conclusion was that, wow, mitigation to climate change benefits from certain types of funding from the ODA, but this doesn't benefit the poorest and most vulnerable countries. And that's why we talk about distortion effects of bilateral funding for the mitigation of climate change on ODA. And to reach this conclusion, we conceptualized what we found in the data in the context of ODA. We focused on ODA allocated with administrative costs, for example. So, and here we estimated the share corresponding to climate funding for mitigation as a share of total ODA. And our conclusion is based on the observations which I will now present. To begin, funding for mitigation under ODA is usually provided through loans and not through grants. So that's the main instrument for ODA in general. So that's the first main difference. And now if we look at sector distribution of this type of funding, so for mitigation, we see that about 2/3 went to activities in the economic sector, energy and transport, for example. If we look at ODA overall, most of it is targeted for social sectors and for humanitarian aid. That's the second contrast. Now on the distribution in terms of geography for mitigation funding as part of ODA, again, about 2/3 of the funding goes to intermediate level countries at the lower level. And then about 1/4 goes to the upper level of intermediate income level countries. And a lot of ODA overall is usually targeted for countries with low incomes, and about 16% of the funding of ODA for mitigation goes to the least advanced countries, and only 1.8% for small island developing states, SIDS. And if you look at the share of ODA which is not for mitigation, we can see that the percentages are much higher. So in fact, ODA funding for mitigation does not go to the countries which need the most international support. And this is a similar analysis around vulnerability. Here we can see that most of the funding goes to the less vulnerable countries, and only 13% of mitigation funding goes to the most vulnerable. And for the others, for other types of ODA, it's much more balanced. That going to the most vulnerable countries is 34%. So in summary of this part of ODA, which is used for mitigation in the form of loans to the economic sector, is mostly to intermediate income level countries and the lesser and vulnerable ones.
So here's what we found with Sylviane. Second, I will now talk about TOSD. For those who do not know what TOSD measures, there are three pillars measured by TOSD: cross-border flows of resources to developing countries, regional and global spending for global public goods, and the third is private funding through guarantees and other types of public interventions. So how is mitigation treated and measured in TOSD? So TOSD measures financing of SDGs. For example, objective number 13 measures relative to the fight against climate change. So this is about funding, spending to fight against climate change, and it is measured by TOSD. Mitigation is included in 13.1, 13.2 of this SDG. Mitigation of climate change is a global public good for TOSD, so it is not so important where the mitigation happens, if it's a developing country or countries such as France or Japan or Canada, high-income countries. For cross-border flows of resources, so Pillar 1 of TOSD, grants, loans, technical cooperation are included for projects or policies for countries, developing countries that mitigate climate change. Second pillar, local and global spending, measures contributions to international organizations such as the UNFCCC, but also, which I find quite interesting, funding for local projects or in high-income countries that mitigate climate change. For example, the European Investment Bank gives loans to European Union countries that target projects for renewable energy, for example. And a third pillar is private funding and other types of funding for mitigation projects. So climate change mitigation is included in TOSD in quite a cross-cutting way. And I'll stop here. And I thank you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion later on. Thank you very much, Thomas. Yes, we're all looking forward to discussing this topic all together. This shows us how sustainable development finance is complex in its multiplicity of objectives.
In fact, these global aid flows, they have a lot of purposes. And this is exactly the theme of the paper written by Xubei Luo, who is a senior economist at the World Bank, and who recently wrote this paper in November 2025, monitoring global aid flows, which is showing that these global aid flows have a complexity of purposes which you can derive from the usual measures, the CRS, which is the in fact a DAC measure of the global aid flows. Xubei, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here today. So let me try to share my screen with a few slides. So thank you very much for having me here. It's such a pleasure. And before I start, just wanted to make a brief disclaimer. I speak in my personal capacity, so the view that I express are mine, and they do not necessarily represent those of the World Bank. So further to the discussion, the two previous speakers, the importance of the distinction between aid that goes to climate mitigation and climate adaptation for the sake of development per se, and also for the development or the creation of the global public goods. So I would like to speak about how we can use AI and machine learning to unpack aid flows and monitoring global aid flows in the sense to contribute to the discussion of measuring how much aid goes from which donor countries to which recipient countries in a granular manner, what exactly sector direction, as well as in what concessionary terms it applies, whether it's grants, whether it's credit or loans. So quite often we use the OECD creditor reporting system data to measure global aid, which has the advantage, which is a standard measure, which is consistent across time and countries. But it also has some limits in the sense, in particular, when we need to measure the granular measures, granular sectors. So, for example, climate or other global public goods, sometimes it's not very clear how we can get this directly from the data. So one way that we are trying to do here is to use AI and machine learning methodology to read into the textual description of the aid records, which has very rich information, and then translate those textual information into signals, into numerical information, so that we can cluster them using the algorithm. So with that, the way that we are trying to do in this sense is to use a bottom-up and unsupervised approach. Let the data speak. For example, we wanted to know whether this is a global public good, whether this is an area that we wanted to see adaptation, mitigation. We wanted to let the data speak up by themselves. So instead of following the predefined category reporting in the OECD CRS data, we let the data to speak and coming up information for the new emerging sectors, also helping to unpack categories that were not clearly defined in the sense of just defining as multi-sectorial aid or even specify as a sector not allocated. So again, here, what we are trying to do is to see from generating a granular database so that we can recategorize and regrouping the information to measure the different elements that we are aiming at to measure. So a little bit getting into the detail, that what we say is that we use the CRS data in 2021, which is about 400,000 aid records. So we use this machine learning approach to generate about 840 granular activity clusters. By granular, I mean we unpack whether this is like education or whether this unpack under education, whether this is like primary education or tertiary education, and also underneath whether this supporting teachers' materials and like. So with that, we can get into the information that we are talking about, we aiming at to capture. A little bit more on the detail that we skip here is running the different measures that we capture the information, processing the data, and using human expertise to rearrange the data to more suitable results. That also complement what we mentioned in the OECD CRS data, that we know that is about like 20 broad category and up to like 265 purpose terms. And then we generate more granular information, about 800 clusters. And we consider this sort of like a golden data set, because with this data set, we can do a lot of calculations, estimations, getting into the detail what exactly this measure, this aid goes into. So now let's get into the main results, complementing to the discussion here we have, is that besides what we capture in the traditional OECD CRS data, we actually can identify emerging trends. So we can see over time how new directions of aid that goes into. And this could include global public goods, like addressing like global aid health challenges, like the pandemic, as well as like food security, besides also like important elements like job creations. So these are sort of like the new emerging areas, including like digitalization, public sector, capital mobilization alike. And it also helped to unpack this multi-sectorial aid, or reporting like whether this multi-sectorial aid is actually going to health and climate, or whether it goes to transport or water, for example. And with that, we can estimate the cross-cutting themes, how much aid that goes into each of these cross-cutting themes, such as climate, and unpack it into climate mitigation or climate adaptation for that sake. We also have some caveats here, because this is sort of like a statistic model, so we focus more on the technical side and ensuring the consistency, not the perfect reproducibility. But the main idea is that when we have this golden data set, we can use this methodology to regroup them and to answer in a more granular manner, in the sense of not only knowing that we have this much aid that goes to an area, it could be like on a specific area, but also a cross-cutting area like climate, like pandemic, alike, but also drilling into exactly what they are. For example, climate mitigation measures, what type of mitigation measure that we are talking about, and from what countries to what countries, the donors, the recipients, and whether this is grant, whether this is loan, and if it's loan, whether it's concessional or unconcessional, the grant equivalent element. So this would be the measure that we are aiming at. And one of the beauty of this model is also because it allows the data to speak for itself. When we feed in the 2021 data, or when we feed into the model like 2022 or 2019, we can see a trend of how these granular measures actually evolve over time. And we capture what countries, donor countries or recipient countries, are gathering more or less. this concessional financing or unconcessional financing, as our colleague just mentioned, that TOSI measures, how we can see this concessionality and the targets of the specific area. So with that, I would like to just stop here on the more technical front and invite you to look into the paper and provide suggestions. And I would like to answer more questions or discussions in our Q&A, how we can actually measure this and on the technical front, how to contribute measuring the flow on the concessional or unconcessional front, climate mitigation or adaptation. And also, if we are interested in any specific areas of any global public goods or the specific areas of climate, we can use the algorithm to scan systematically the description of the aid flows and gather that information. Because if we just use the data in the global data set, sometimes there could be underestimation because there might be measures that are targeting, let's say, infrastructure in general, but there are specific elements that are targeting climate resilience that would be captured using the AI and machine learning model. So let me stop here. Back to you, Bruno. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Xubei. C'était tout à fait intéressant et j'invite effectivement.
Thank you very much, Xubei. It was extremely interesting. And yes, I invite all of those listening to read this article, an article that looks at all of the issues we've already mentioned. And to speak about another example between the intersectionality of the Fund for Global Public Goods and for development and sustainable development, there is the fight against epidemics and pandemics. And this illustrates quite well that sometimes there is no additionality, not only for the global public good that is the climate, but also for the global public good that is health. Thank you very much, Xubei. Now I will give the floor to Désiré Vencatachellum, who is a professor at Johannesburg University. He's also part of a very important South African think tank. Maybe we should get back to the question of why, because Désiré Vencatachellum was also part of the African Development Bank and was using metrics of flows of sustainable developments and GPGs. And so, Désiré, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Bruno. First of all, I would like to thank Ferdi and especially Professor Guillaumont. I am now a senior fellow of Ferdi since the 1st of July, and I'm extremely happy to be here today. With your permission, I will speak in English because these are topics that I've mostly worked on in English, but I can answer questions later on in French, of course.
So at first sight, it may appear that what we are talking about today is pure statistics, pure classification, and pure accounting. But for me, it is much bigger and it is at a much higher level, because at the end of the day, it is about fairness, it is about incentives, and as we speak now, it is also about the future in the international development finance architecture. I think I want to start where Serge also spoke about. He said, and this is about the fundamental distinction between development finance and financing global public goods. I think he said it all. I don't need to repeat. The beneficiaries of development investments are mainly in country, and we all know the non-rival and non-excludable nature of global public good. So while this distinction is clear, the reality is much more complex because development and global public goods are increasingly being financed from the same pool of, unfortunately, diminishing concessional resources. And we need to find a way to talk about that squarely. And we also need to find a way to recognize what developing countries are doing, in particular African countries. And let me illustrate this with one example, which is the example of a Congo Basin. According to the World Bank, there's a report which came out, I think, August 2025. The Congo Basin stores around 90 billion tons of carbon, just second to the Amazon. And the Center for Global Development estimates that the Congo Basin removes carbon from the atmosphere each year, valued at around $55 billion. Just the Congo Basin. This is what it absorbs. And if you contrast that number, this is more than ODA flowing to sub-Saharan Africa in 2025, just to give you an order of measure. So we devote enormous effort to measure financial flows from developed countries, from donors to developing countries, but we also need to do the same, to measure contributions that developing countries themselves make to provide global public goods. And in particular, focusing on Africa, the narrative very often is that Africa is merely a recipient of development finance. But Africa is also one of the world's largest providers of global public goods. This contribution remains largely invisible in the metrics, and this is a shame. It matters because what we do not measure is rarely valued, and what is not valued is rarely financed appropriately. So if our metrics capture mainly donors' financial transfers, while global services that developing countries provide are underestimated, then we have an issue. And we have a big issue, especially at a time where ODA, and I think Tomas is better placed being at OECD than myself to talk about that. ODA has peaked, and ODA to Africa is now, I think it's dropped by about more than 10 billion in a year. So that's the broader context. As we speak of the metrics, I would like us not to forget about this. The second point I want to make is about development and global public goods. I do not believe that we should oppose development to global public goods. There are two sides of the same coins. They should never be presented as competing priorities. If you take, for instance, sustainable forestry, be it in West Africa and Central Africa, populations are in the best interest to have sustainable livelihoods and to be able to export sustainable timber. But for them to do that, you need roads, you need electricity, you need institutions. So unfortunately, you have a huge financing gap, an infrastructure financing gap, and the question is not whether we should focus on global public good or whether we should focus on development, but we need to do both at the same time. And we need to elevate better metrics to capture both. Now, when we speak of global public goods, it is not a new issue. It's time immemorial. It reminds me of the tragedy of the commons. And this is where today, as we focus on metrics, I feel a little bit sad. If you go back to the Paris Agreement, there was a clear global consensus that we can coordinate and we can have clear targets. And these clear targets matter. And unfortunately, last month, the World Bank decided to drop its target. on climate. While this may seem immaterial, for me it is very important because having clear target is a commitment strategy. It helps people focus and it helps mobilize resources. And I want also, and I'll be very short after that, to go back to this issue of African countries not being seen only as recipients. And I want to take the example of Central African Republic, which is part of the Congo Basin. The GDP per capita of Central African Republic is $600. The GDP per capita of the average OECD citizen is more than $50,000. But colleagues, what we find is, because of the Congo Basin global public good, you have citizens of the Central African Republic subsidizing OECD countries. That is not appropriate. So we need to recognize it. And my last point is on financing global public good, what works. When I was at the African Development Bank, the bank came up with what we thought, and I think there may be some colleagues, ex-colleagues from the African Development Bank, for the 16th replenishment of African Development Fund, it innovated with a climate action window, which is a concessional arm of African Development Bank Group. And the objective was very straightforward. It is to allow countries who have an interest in supporting exactly what Serge was saying, adaptation projects in the most fragile, the most vulnerable countries to do so. And they would be able to report to the powers that be that 100% of their contribution is for climate. We did that. We expected to be very successful. We were successful. Out of a replenishment, we got $500 million. But what I made to understand is that the last ADF replenishment, ADF 17, we were not able, I mean, my past colleagues were not able to find new contributors to the climate action window. So there is an issue, and the open question is on climate, how do we link funds like IDA, like ADF to vertical funds? I think this is an important conversation to be had. And we have important innovations that have been done, but given the constraint on overall ODA, maybe they are no longer sustainable, those innovations. So just to conclude, I'll conclude with 3 quick observations. As I said, development finance and financing for global public goods should never be seen as competing priorities. If we do that, then we have crowding out effects, we don't have real additionality, we have a problem. Second, it is not merely a statistical exercise to distinguish between development finance and financing global public good. It is about the future of the international finance architecture, and it is also about recognizing who is doing what. The third point, MDBs have a very important role to play, and the experience of the African Development Fund Climate Action Window shows that it is possible to create a dedicated mechanism for adaptation purposes. So, but let me end where I started and what I said a couple of times. It would be unfortunate if low-income countries and developing countries are only seen through the lens of the recipients of those funds and not seen as, in most cases, doing the bulk of the heavy lifting to preserve the global public goods. And as we go forward, I think it would be good. And the TOS-D initiative is fantastic, is how do we elevate that initiative or others to better capture what recipient countries or low-income countries are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Désiré, and thank you very much for having raised a number of new topics that we hadn't broached yet. The first being not only to distinguish between existing funding flows, but also to better measure the contributions to global public goods, notably of the Congo Basin. Second topic was to look at beyond statistics, the very world financial architecture and possible solutions to find distinctions with vertical funds to fund global public goods and through other channels also contribute to sustainable development. So through the distribution channels to have clearer measurements of between these two financial flows. And I will now come back to Serge Tomasi, because the last part of your presentation on the how, well, has left us wanting more, because there are solutions which are intellectually satisfying to measure these two types of flows between sustainable development and global public goods, and flows for mitigation, but it's difficult operationally. Another solution would be to measure mitigation flows and on the other adaptation flows, but this leaves open the question of mitigation flows, which can also contribute to targeted geographies and their sustainable development, which is why this first solution is so wonderful. So we can see that the how is very difficult to characterize. So are there any other possibilities? Or should we give up? And then what about taking into account the various contributions to global public goods, which go well beyond financing flows, but which make it possible to measure externalities, which should also be measured through services provided by nature in a variety of areas of the world. These services are provided to all, and they're very important. Thank you, Bruno. To react to this, let me react to something that Désiré said, saying that we shouldn't pit the two against each other, global public goods and development funding. I was in New York in 1998 when my friend Inge Kohl presented for the very first time his work on the funding of global public goods as a new strand for development. And I remember that most developing countries were actually very reticent because they feared that global public goods would take up all of the funding and leave none for development. It's important to fund both and to contribute to both. But so that the distribution is optimal and effective, we do need to monitor funding for these two goals, or that we put in safeguards to ensure that the poorest countries are penalized. When I look at recent changes in development funding, I note that throughout the growth of ODA, the growth was strongly induced by two phenomena. First of all, climate funding, which was a driver to increase international assistance, but as we saw, mostly geared towards middle-income countries. And then more recently, this is funding for conflict countries with a sharp increase in assistance to Ukraine, but Ukraine is a middle-income country. And today, where there's a sharp decrease of ODA, see our work in the National Commission to assess ODA, that the most vulnerable countries are those hit hardest by these reductions in ODA. So my suggestion would be to say we should turn away from these major funding objectives to focus on objectives which apply to smaller categories to ensure that poorest countries aren't penalized. For example, for the least advanced countries, we always talk about the General Assembly of the United Nations to reach 0.7% of GNI devoted to ODA. But a second objective was set by that General Assembly, which was to devote 0.15 of the GNI to lesser advanced countries. Today, I think that if we're going to set objectives for climate funding, the last COP set an objective of $300 billion for climate funding by 2030. In parallel, we should also secure funding for the least developed countries and, for example, increase this targeted funding for the least developed countries to 0.2 or 0.25% of GNI, and to ensure that funding for the poorest countries is not reduced because the other objectives are being funded, for example, global public goods, such as the climate. Similarly, if we focus on climate funding, at the last COP, it was very positive that we set a target for adaptation. But again, following the work of Sylviane, Guillaume, and Tomas, showing that in concessional funding for adaptation, this mostly goes to intermediate level countries, and I think that we should set a sum apart for the least developed countries to ensure that they're not penalized. The goal always being that the most concessional assistance must go to the countries with the lowest incomes because they're being doubly penalized. They don't have sufficient savings in their own country because they don't have access to international financial markets, nor to most of the non-concessional funding by multilateral development banks. And my third remark, and I will end there, this is also to react to a remark by Désiré. I believe he said he's talking about measuring the contribution of countries, of developing countries, to the funding of global public goods, which is considerable. And it's true that the Congo Basin countries do partake in funding global public goods by preserving their forest in the Congo Basin, because this forest is an enormous carbon sink. Brazil is doing the same with the Amazon forest, and Madagascar similarly by preserving the local fauna and flora, which are unique in the world. And thankfully, Tosti has made it possible to render justice to these contributions, which are now being monitored and measured in the framework of Tosti. But now the question is, can we go even further? And taking experiences such as RED Plus, so to compensate these efforts made at national level by developing countries for global public goods, so benefiting the world population. I will stop here. Thank you. Thank you very much, Serge. Since you mentioned Tosti, I will perhaps give the floor to Thomas Hoos to say a few words about this, about national contributions. But I don't think not everything is measured in ecosystemic services. So what does Tosti tell us more and what could Toasty bring in addition but doesn't yet?
Thank you very much for your question. I think there are multiple things that make TOSD useful. We could look at cross-border flows, for example, or spending for GPGs. So for cross-border flows, what TOSD does that is extremely useful, especially when talking about targets for adaptation, least developed countries, it is the availability of data on concessionality. According to the universal rules of the IMF and the World Bank. Concessionality can be calculated in many different ways. If you look for a more conservative definition of concessionality, then you look at the World Bank and the IMF, which is used in TOSD. So in terms of public development funding for climate, which could be considered to be ODA, it might not be consensual according to the definition of the IMF or the World Bank. And so TOSD data is very trustworthy on that front. We collect data on mitigation. TOSD is not a new type of metric, but it is still only 7 years old. So we need to strengthen data collection for different providers when it comes to mitigation in different countries. Not everyone gives us data. We're very happy with what we have, but we could do better. Another topic, biodiversity, considered as a GPG. Biodiversity is global in the way that everything depends on the stability of biodiversity. So domestic spending for biodiversity is also recorded in TOSD. For example, Italy will report their domestic spending for biodiversity. There's also microeconomic stability. The world economy can be unstable if there are issues even in just one country, one G7 country, for example. So we also collect this type of data. There's something that is maybe a bit new, but we're also working on domestic spending for hosting refugees. Countries of the global north already report this type of data, partially, when it comes to ODA in the TOSD. They can report this type of data, report the cost of integration as well. We worked in the Chad a few months ago, and we estimated the domestic cost for Chad when it comes to hosting Sudanese refugees from the Darfur. And we will present the results of our analysis during our annual meeting, the General Assembly, in Peru in October. And you're very much welcome to take part in that General Assembly if you are interested.
L'autre pilote à ce sujet prendra lieu probablement à Équateur. Donc,
so there are many types of GPGs, and slowly we're developing a methodology to include the different types of GPGs in the TOSG. And we're also collecting data, of course. And I think it will be indeed interesting to look at all of this in a more granular way, perhaps. Thank you very much. The journey of TOSG is very inspiring, very motivating. In a potential future, could TOSG answer in a way the criticism of Désiré of not only measuring financial flows, but also measuring the impact of some countries, such as the Congo, for example, of the forest of the Congo. Is this possible? Is it possible, for example, to measure the biodiversity of Madagascar and what it adds to mitigation, not just the financial flows that sustain biodiversity, but biodiversity itself? For now, measuring GPGs is fully based on spending. Will this change in the future? I cannot say. It depends on our members, on the International Forum on TOSD. They decide how we measure, what we measure. And what is quite specific to our forum is that it is open to all countries. Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. If they want to work on this type of topic, then maybe we will do that in the future. Maybe we will change our methodology if the countries wish us to do so. Thank you, Thomas. So we have a few questions from our chat. Mathieu, would you like to select some questions? Yes, hello everyone. So we've received a few questions. And thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our speakers as well. A question we've received, perhaps for Serge. On metrics governance, all speakers agree on the necessity to better separate the different financial flows, but who should bring this reform about? International institutions, banks, a new organization? Is there a consensus? So perhaps a question for everyone. So other questions, one on loss and damage. So we've talked a lot about climate and the difference between mitigation and adaptation. But what of projects linked to loss and damages? How could we separate those three topics linked to climate? A question perhaps for Xubei and Tomas. to what extent could the type of methodology of Xubei law could be used to the OECD by the OECD and TOSD to improve granularity? Thank you, Mathieu. So this last question was for Xubei and Thomas. I will first give the floor to Xubei, who hasn't spoken yet in this section of the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the discussion and the questions. So let me just give some more context on this paper. So in the current recent years, we see a shift of the development finance landscape. The concessional financing has become more and more constrained. And then we also see trends like the fragmentation, proliferation, and circumvention of aid, in the sense that there are more providers of aid, but also the average amount of aid, in particular in the concessional terms, it's becoming smaller and smaller. And a large share of aid actually goes through other channels besides the government channel for implementation. So this also altogether raise challenges of how to make the aid use more effective. And then we also see more aid goes to vertical funds compared with country-based like horizontal platform. So there are how to direct this and making this more effective. So just give some context on the importance of measuring aid, where it comes from, to where, which sector, and then and make this limited concessional resources more useful in support of the development as well as global public goods. So I really support the ideas that development, economic development, as well as global public good are really two sides of the same coin for development in total. Getting to the answer of how this methodology that we develop using AI and machine learning to cultivate data from OECD, yes. So the answer is, so in the methodology we have, getting into the technical part, we have defined different parameters and similarity score thresholds that actually gauges the clusters, how these newly emerging granular clusters that we develop using the AI and ML model, we can adjust these parameters and we can capture that. And also, like I just mentioned in the presentation, if we are specifically interested in certain subjects, like fragility or like climate mitigation, climate adaptation, we can use these particular wordings, the text analytics that we are using AI and machine learning to do. We can do, quote unquote, a scan to capture this information and collect the information, inform the granular cluster forming. So these are techniques that we can discuss, and it probably goes way more into the detail, and I will be very happy if we can have an offline discussion getting into the algorithm, how to make this work for the different purpose. And in terms of the support of global public goods, I would like to just mention two mechanisms that the World Bank Group currently have in support of the initiative of the effort that have regional or global cross-border externality. So one is from the IDA side for the poor countries from International Development Association. For IDA 21, there is actually a new window called GROW, Global and Regional Opportunity Window, that is particularly designed to support cross-border initiatives that have benefit that's not limited to one country or the host country, in that sense, that could include like climate, fragilities alike. So this is an additional funding that the poor countries, either member countries, can have. These are concessional resources that are dedicated specifically to global and regional public goods. And from the IBID side, so mainly for like middle-income countries, including upper middle-income countries, lower middle-income countries alike. So this is the framework for financial incentive, or the FFI, which is providing concessional financing to support equivalent like the cross-border initiatives, again, like climate fragility and the like. These are global public goods, and the support comes from, in the sense of volume, sense, and price, also and maturity tenors alike. That's actually support the development of projects that address challenges that have global or regional nature. So again, thank you for the questions. I'm very happy to discuss more on the technical details. Thank you. Back to you.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Xubei.
J'ai envie de transférer la question
I would like
gouvernance
to
à la fois
now talk about governance with Désiré and Serge.
Dans leur appréciation,
I would
selon
like
si le
for
modèle
them
qui a été adopté par
to
le TOSDI pour la
say
gouvernance de ces
if
nouvelles mesures,
the
c'est-à-dire un
TOSD
forum
model with an
intergouvernemental
open
ouvert,
international
est celui qui est
forum
le plus
is
adapté,
the
ou est-ce qu'il
best
faut aller
model,
au-delà
or
d'un
should we go beyond
intergouvernemental? Désiré,
that
peut-être sur cette
even?
question.
Désiré, perhaps?
Merci.
Thank you, Bruno. Before answering this question, I would like to react to what has been said before, if you'll allow me. When it comes to concessionality, I understand that there are norms and standards, of course, but there is something important to me. It's not about norms. When something is provided by a country, by people, there must be a question of compensation, of a grant, perhaps. And to me, grants are concessional. But the reality is financial flows towards developing countries, and specifically ODA towards African countries, is shrinking dramatically. So what are we talking about here? What is the real topic here? The numbers of ODA towards Africa was 67 billions in 2020-2021, 66 billion in 2022-2023, and it has now it keeps getting smaller and smaller. There's an issue of the size of ODA that we need to mention. And when Serge started, he talked about additionality, and this is essential. How do we ensure additionality in a context where ODA is almost disappearing? And obviously, I don't have an answer, but it is a fundamental question. Consensuality when it comes to climate should be grants. And when the amount of money is getting smaller and smaller, how do we manage? When it comes to governance, I understand what Thomas says. Everyone is around the table in TOSD. But in my experience, in this type of forum, everyone is present, but not everyone has the same voice. If some countries are opposed to something, nothing will happen. Absolutely nothing. We won't be able to use those metrics or whatever has been said. I don't know what happens around the table in TOSG, but when I participated in negotiations, as soon as you started talking about climate finance, if you mentioned the Paris Agreement, you were immediately vetoed and nothing could be done. So we have not yet found a solution to this in a multilateral framework. Do we need to invent something different? Do global South countries need to take the initiative and say, we will do the reporting in an environment such as TOSD, perhaps? So I think we really need to put everything on the table and have a real discussion about this. Thank you.
Merci,
Thank you,
Désiré.
Désiré.
Avant que Thomas
Perhaps before Thomas starts defending the
l'organisation
TOSD, which is what I think he will do, I will now give the floor to Serge on this topic of governance and also other topics we've mentioned. We've talked about additionality between different flows, sustainable development flows, and GPG flows. But there's another additionality need. We've talked about compensation for loss and damages, for example. So do we need a triple additionality? Is this possible?
Non seulement la contribution aux biens publics mondiaux,
is it possible to have contributions to GPGs, but also compensation?
Et je ne suis pas sûr que ça
And
recoupe, pour répondre,
I'm sorry to answer
ce sont des statistiques en
like this
équivalent
to Désiré when he talked about statistics and so on. Now, concessional financing is shrinking and the needs are growing.
Presque au titre des compensations sur les biens publics mondiaux. Donc, boucler cette équation,
so for this equation to work, perhaps we could do more concessional loans with less concessionality, with an equivalent in grants. But if we use the loaning tool more, there will be a distortion, and we could perhaps leave the poorest and most vulnerable countries behind. So it is something to take into account. Serge, you have the floor.
So just two quick remarks. On governance, currently there are two fora for the monitoring of funding of development, public development, and this is TOSD, which has for years has been refusing to open up and to welcome developing countries and prefers to remain a forum for donor countries making their annual notifications, their annual reports. The yearly TOSD Forum at least welcomes most of the traditional donors in developed countries, with a few rare exceptions. The beneficiary countries and developing countries, and I know the important role played by South Africa and Brazil on the question of monitoring the funding of global public goods, for example, and also a lot of international organizations. So it's a much more inclusive forum. And I don't think it's a coincidence that there is this distinction between funding for development and funding for global public goods was initiated. So I believe that it's in this type of forum that this discussion should be continued. Then, of course, board of directors of multilateral development banks and bilateral development agencies also have to become involved. The main difficulty, in my view, is that at institutional level, there are parallel processes for financing development, the conference in Addis Ababa, the United Nations Conference on Development, and then the biodiversity and climate COPs with their own specific processes. They each have their own objectives, and they're not necessarily compatible. So we need to reconcile the two or create bridges, conferences on funding development or funding the climate or funding biodiversity. And to remark to the question that Désiré raised, is fundamental. Unfortunately, for the past 2 years, very clear. We're no longer at all following a logic of additionality. Now we're looking at fractions. And who's going to be most penalized in this drop in development finance? Will it be the climate? Will it be development? Will it be the least advanced countries? So that is the current situation. And I would even go further. I've been struck by the success and the rise of discourse around funding international partnerships. For example, the latest meeting of the G7. This is a way of completely doing away with funding for the question of funding for development. So funding for the poorest countries with a switch to mutual benefits, a level playing field. I believe that we are dangerously moving away from the main question, which was to fight against international inequalities and assist the poorest countries. Thank you, Serge. Tomas, perhaps explain just a little bit around the governance of TOSD and perhaps respond to the criticism or the remarks by Désiré and Serge around this forum, which is an inclusive forum. But how can we perhaps improve its governance? If I may, first, Bruno, we have a request in our online participants from the Secretariat of DAC, who's in charge of the statistics services of DAC from the OECD. If you could give her the floor afterwards. Okay, thank you. Just to clarify, we haven't gotten there yet. We don't have hundreds of members. It's an open forum. We constantly work with countries who are not members of the forum yet to ensure that they can become members. Currently, we have 29 member countries and 4 international organizations. Out of the 29 countries, about half of them belong to the group of 77, so belonging to the Global South. We've continued increasing the number of members, but it's important to have a balanced composition for the forum to work properly. We accept countries from the north as members only if we also have new members from the Global South to always have a balance. Now, as for governance, we realize that when there are lots of countries that are involved, sometimes it can make it very difficult for decisions to be made if consensus is required, or if there are a lot of participants in the process. Decision-making process, they can make it extremely lengthy. So we have a steering committee that makes decisions with a maximum of 3 members. So taking part in the pilot study group is renewed on a regular basis because there are more member organizations than there are participants who can be in the pilot group. And normally this decision is taken by consensus. If that's not possible, then there's the possibility to launch another procedure. I'm not sure to say it well in French. So by majority vote, a 2/3 majority vote. So if 2/3 of the countries agree, then the decision is approved. So this is in reaction to the very valid possibility of having blockages. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tomas. And I give the floor to the Secretariat of the DAC. Hello. I don't know that. Hello, Madame Gavo. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I know that the webinar will be ending, but thank you very much for this discussion, which has been extremely interesting and very useful that we have think tanks such as Ferdi tackling this type of topic and grabbing the bull by the horns to think about this type of metrics. The message I wanted to convey at a technical level, I'm not at the head of the statistics office, just of a unit within the statistics office that looks at methodologies and standards. So the message I wanted to convey that we do try within DAC to open up to our outside partners. We're currently undergoing a review and a working level on statistics, a working party on statistics. We've set up a forum, as we call it, which is open to partner countries, organizations, think tanks. And I think this would be a great opportunity for your contribution. The next forum is on the 8th of October, and we have a session on metrics specifically. Okay, we won't change DAC from one day to the next, but we do our best to consult around metrics, so we have everyone around the table. This will be our second edition. We haven't, our ambitions are still quite modest, but you would all be extremely welcome. And then on Xubei's report, we also work a lot with LM methodologies and the CRS to not continue creating new taxonomies. So more and more, we use AI to analyze these domains which are not specifically identified with existing taxonomies. So we're working on pandemic preparedness and response, which I believe could be considered a global public good. So we have a sub-working group talking about these very technical issues, and it would be wonderful if Xubei were available to present her study and exchange with our members. Then the distinction between development, climate funding. I've been here for over 25 years, and this question of additionality has always been around. And I think your approach of trying to find a pragmatic angle is a very good approach, because conceptually it's very difficult. I believe Tomas will not contradict me, but I think that within TOSTE, it's like with CRS, a development project that also contributes to mitigation is a single project, but for us it's development finance, pillar one in TOSTE and CRS. But thank you very much for having given me the floor. Thank you very much for your intervention and for your invitation to the forum. If I may speak on behalf of Ferdi, we'll be very happy to take part and to talk about metrics, as you suggested. This is currently one of our major preoccupations. So we've gone over time, but nonetheless, I would like to give the floor for some concluding remarks. So just 2 or 3 minutes, no more, to Serge Tomasi. Well, thank you, Bruno. My conclusion is that today, the top priority, because you always need priorities, is to defend development funding and the amounts of development funding. And we have to put an end to this drastic drop in funding, which is striking pretty much all donors and which will have a terrible effect on the development of poorest countries and on global public goods, such as fighting against pandemics or or climate change. So we have to continue talking about metrics, about modalities for allocating assistance. But what's most urgent is to stop this drop in funding for development and global public goods. And yes, and to stop this decline in funding for the most vulnerable countries and the least developed countries. So, with this conclusion, which Ferdi agrees with completely, I thank all of our participants and I end our webinar. And I apologize for having gone over by 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Serge, Tomas, Xubei, Désiré, for these debates, which were very rich.
Au revoir.